Do we say tomorrow's golf league? Does anybody even do that? Is it just TGL? I mean, it's the new gamified, digitized South Florida Golf League, spurred by Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods. Drew was there. Um, we'll go through some of the. I'll just go through some of the numbers here before I pass it over to you, Drew, to kind of talk through what you saw in person. So, averaging around 500,000 viewers overall per broadcast. That, quote, exceeded ESPN's pre launch expectations, according to Sportico. Very good number if you look at a lot of other new leagues, especially, but even, frankly, a lot of just leagues, period. Median age of audience was competitive with the NBA and like 12 years younger than most PGA golf events. So that is obviously a huge arrow in their quiver. That is something golf has desperately needed for a long time. The one thing I could not find, I have not, I feel like I've re-Googled this a dozen times as we've tried to talk about it on the show or I've covered it. There are no details on the broadcast deal with ESPN. No dollar figure, no anything that I can find. So maybe you know more than me, Drew, but let us know if so, and then take us through kind of what you saw and heard as you were able to venture out there and check it out for yourself.
Yeah. So to answer that question quickly, CNBC's Alex Sherman actually had a report on this earlier this week. It's the first time I'd seen any number. Said less than $10 million per year from ESPN. So
Okay.
it's very insignificant, the media rights deal, which is important context, right? Like, this is a very expensive startup. They built an entire stadium. I mean, not even 14 months ago, that stadium collapsed and they had to rebuild it. So there's been a lot of investment in TGL from the get-go. And, less than $10 million in rights fees isn't really going to keep the lights on there. But you just laid out a lot of the data that I would like to touch on as well. It's like, this has been a successful first season for them. Over 500,000 viewers. I believe that's approximately 20% of a bigger audience, larger viewership than the comparable windows last year. So that was mostly college basketball, some NHL, some studio programming when they're on ESPN2. That's a pretty impressive number. Like, that's kind of the benchmark that you're going for as a new league. Like, am I better than the replacement level programming that we're taking over? And TGL was very successful at that. And like you mentioned, the young audience, competing with the NBA, which is kind of the belle of the ball when it comes to demographics. That's incredibly impressive for a sport that is essentially golf, right? Like, golf is not a sport that generally attracts younger television audiences. So it's hard to argue that TGL hasn't had a successful first year.
What would you attribute that to? Why it is so attractive to younger audiences? Is it the technology aspect of it? Is it the names involved? Like, why would this league, upstart league without any history, why would this be what's attracting a younger audience?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think when you talk to people involved in TGL, they say it's because it looks like a video game, right? This is very familiar to a younger audience. And, funnily enough, about 2 years ago now, I did a similar story on my old publication over at Live Golf. And it's the same exact thing that they told me. We're trying to make the broadcast look like a video game. But it's very clear that TGL has actually been able to capitalize on that and get that younger audience. Whereas Live, I believe, their median age is somewhere up in the 60s. I think it's close to 62. TGL's is a full decade younger than that. So, when we're talking about golf's two kind of renegade leagues here, it's clear who the winner is when it comes to attracting that younger demo.
I think the other aspect of it, just from what I've seen, because I mean, we should lay out just overall what the experience of watching this and kind of how it works, right? They drive off of a tee in the arena. It's similar to a lot of golf simulators people have played in, whatever arcade or whatever. It's the highest possible tech version of that. And then they putt on a green in live, right? So it's kind of a combination of both. And I think that what I like about it, what I could see people who might not love golf liking about it, is elements that it borrows from, I would say, another golf experiment, which like the match, right? The hangout, the vibe, the atmosphere, the looseness of it. I think honestly, the golfers being game to play along and not be so buttoned up has been a huge part of it. But I would say another element of it is, you mentioned investment from, like, fundraisers and whatnot. It's also been a bigger commitment from ESPN than I would have ever expected. I think the talent that they've put onto this helps that atmosphere along in a big way, whether that's Scott Van Pelt obviously being more of that sense of authority and doing interviews and whatnot, but Matt Berry at the desk, and then especially Marty Smith, I think has knocked it out of the park, or knocked it into the screen and through a video game, fairway, I guess might be the better metaphor for this. But like, that I think is part of what's fun. It's passive viewing for sure. Like, it's something to kind of just have on, but it's fun and loose and interesting enough that it is maybe better than other passive viewing options. Like, it feels kind of reductive because these are people actually playing a game, but I think that I was surprised, Drew, that everybody that you talked to seemed to basically say that. They're not shy about the fact that that's what they're going for, and I do think that they've really succeeded in creating that, and I think that's a big part of why young people would want to watch it.
Yeah, and I want to touch on your first point there as well, how you said you compared it to the match, right, which has been a long-running series on TNT. That's a little bit of a scary comparison when I look at TGL. Because if you've looked at the recent editions of the match, despite still getting like really A-list talent to go out there and play golf, the viewership has not been good. It has declined a fair bit since that first one between Tiger and Phil. So I actually asked that specific question while I was there. I said, how do you make this about the golf, right? Because it's not a proven it's not proven to be successful when you rely on professional golfers' personalities to be driving the television show, right? These guys are not the most entertaining people. A lot of them are very stoic. Like, that's how you become good at golf. So while there are some personalities on TGL, building an entire franchise around golfers' personalities probably isn't the most sustainable. So I think the next step for TGL is really like, how do you get people to care about who's winning and who's losing, what teams are winning, like who's going to, win the championship at the end of the season. And that's going to be a much heavier lift than, this first season where it's still been a bit of a novelty.
It feels like a cross between like esports being the kind of thing that, the video game stuff makes you think of, but also it had me thinking about, and maybe this is because I've been reading, as Ben and I had talked about last week, the ESPN oral history, and there's a whole section in there about the World Series of Poker and how much of a shocking success that was. It kind of feels like it's somewhere in that neighborhood too, where it's like, again, but I don't care. I wouldn't personally care about who was going to win the poker game that happened to be featured on camera for the 10 minutes I swung through watching that in 2006 or whatever. So I do think that's a big issue. I also think the obvious other issue is the same one that golf has, which is, what do you do when Tiger's not involved, right? And what happens if you're talking about personalities and results and actually wanting this to feel like a league and not just something people happen to have on their TVs. It's kind of like the Caitlin Clark thing with WNBA ratings last year, where it's like, okay, that's what it was total, but what if you strip away Caitlin? What does it look like? It's that kind of same dynamic with Tiger this year, where he's drawing 1 million plus, but the weeks where the broadcasts where his team's not playing, things obviously dip as they have for years now, as Tiger's career is kind of faded. So what do you think, Ben? How would you try to develop that with this, from what you've watched and trying to get it to matter a little more to people?
I think, and I'm not, the most golf savvy person. I do think one interesting aspect that's just caught me as a casual viewer has been the team aspect of it. And I don't know how sustainable that is. Like, if you're going to have people growing up being diehard fans of TGL teams, but it was kind of jarring. Like I got an email, from the hat brand 47 promoting TGL hats. I'm like, what's this cool LA hat? Like, what's this? And I click on it and it's like all these TGL, all this gear, all this merch. And like, I'm not accustomed to that being a part of my golf viewing experience as a fan. So I don't know. I don't know if that has staying power, but I could see that being at least one avenue to generating brand loyalty, especially if the hats are cool.
Yeah, and the reason for something like that happening, TGL has so many like insanely powerful businessmen like involved, like that are owning teams that have invested in tomorrow's sport. You have the Fenway Sports Group, you have Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, the former 76ers owner. Like there's a lot of people that have a lot of experience running professional sports franchises that are obviously involved with companies like 47 Hats and whatnot that are able to push this product out there and have the networks to really kind of expand on TGL's first season. That's, I think, when I look at the bull case for TGL, that's a big part of the reason why I think this could be a successful venture.
So the team and like the team loyalty, team affinity, fandom aspect of it reminds me of a problem that I think one thing that connects TGL to Unrivaled, which has kind of been this randomly like sister news story to TGL because it's another upstart league, also weirdly both in South Florida, and they, I think, have the same problem where I've checked out Unrivaled a little bit because I just, have covered women's sports a lot, care about the WNBA stuff, and that's obviously just a growing sport that I'm curious about. And I don't know who the hell's on any team over there. I have to look it up every time. They tell me who's about to be playing. That gives me no info, whatever. But I think another thing that aside from the geographical and that comparison that ties these two together is it's kind of been this business story from the standpoint of, we talk about it with like, my Phoenix Suns team, the Stars and Scrubs kind of roster building model. I almost think of it the same way with ESPN right now, where they're paying exorbitant amounts for football, basketball, college football. They just parted ways with Formula One and MLB, and we'll see where that goes. And they're, I think, experimenting with the idea of can things like this be innings eaters, be, bench players for them to just survive in the slots where baseball and other things might have been in a past era where things were, costs were more spread out and there was more costs that they could even allot. So I guess my question for you, Drew, is like where do TGL ratings have to kind of steady out for that to feel viable to you? Or does it flip and maybe ESPN eventually could move off of it and it just becomes actually a good investment for a smaller network that doesn't need such a high threshold? What do you kind of think happens there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when you think about ESPN dropping Major League Baseball, this is another thing I actually asked while I was down there. I said, what does like a summer league look like? Like, would you guys want to expand into some of those windows that are freshly available? And that's just a huge challenge for the overall golf schedule because the summertime is kind of the heart of major season, and getting guys to agree to want to play on Mondays and Tuesday nights when they could be, heading to Augusta National or any other major venue would be challenging. So I wouldn't necessarily expect TGL to expand into that part of the calendar, but I do see your point where like if TGL can find like a baseline audience, which I believe, they probably have this season, it'll be much more interesting to see, what the numbers look like next season. But there's clearly an audience there, right? Like it's very digestible 2-hour windows. It's on nights of the week that there's really nothing else going on aside from, college basketball. So it just gives people another option. And I think that's really been the value proposition for the league thus far. It's like, it's just not competing with anything.
That's I think their timing on the calendar, just again from my own personal anecdotal experience, that's what stood out. Just talking to my friends, it's like, all right, Tuesday night's TGL night. Like this has replaced Maction on the calendar for our viewing habits in the fall. And so the fact that they have picked this time in the calendar where it can kind of stand out separate from football season, you're not, in the heart of golf's diehard season. Basketball still kind of mulling to the finish line in its playoffs. I think that's in terms of what's working. It seems like they picked like the perfect spot on the calendar for this.